Demographic changes continued to undermine the Christian communities, while the system, preferring the now non-existent Christian majority, remained unchanged, much to the disaffection of the Muslim communities, both Sunni and Shiite. The Palestinian refugee population, which had arrived in Lebanon in 1948, at that time some 150,000, whose number steadily increased with time to over 300,000, and who were kept in refugee camps and were not integrated into the Lebanese population, contributed further to the destabilization of the Lebanese system. In the late 1960s, Palestinian armed groups concentrated in Lebanon's refugee camps and established bases of operations against Israel in southern Lebanon, leading in turn to Israeli retaliation strikes against targets in Lebanon. After the civil war in Jordan in 1970-71 and the consequent expulsion of Palestinian fighting forces from there, Lebanon became the Palestinians' sole semi-autonomous base of operations against Israel. This created internal Lebanese tensions between the Sunnis, who prefer to see Lebanon as an Arab state, deeply committed to the conflict with Israel, and therefore supportive of the Palestinian struggle waged from Lebanon, as opposed to the Maronites, who saw Lebanon as a Christian-dominated pro-Western state that had no real interest in the fight with Israel. Thus, a combination of domestic tensions and external factors contributed to the eventual outbreak of civil war, yet again in Lebanon. In April 1975, clashes erupted between Palestinian forces and the Maronite Phalange militia, which rapidly degenerated into a more general conflict between Christians and Muslims. The Lebanese army could not be counted on to restore order. The Lebanese army collapsed as many of its men joined the rival forces in the civil war according to their respective sectarian origins. Syria, however, was now strong and stable under Hafiz Assad, and it was Syrian intervention that brought the first phase of the war to its conclusion. Most surprisingly, Syria intervened in May 1976 on behalf of the Christians, who were facing defeat by the Palestinians and the radical Sunni Muslim alliance. After all, Syria as a radical state in the conflict with Israel could be expected to side with the Palestinians against the Maronites, but in May 1976 the Syrians did precisely the opposite. Syria took advantage of the war to enhance its regional clout and prestige by assuming virtual control of Lebanon. Syria was presumably also concerned that a radical takeover of Lebanon would expose Syria to possible war with Israel at a time not of Syria's choosing. Syria could hardly allow the Palestinians in Lebanon the leeway to make decisions that could have far-reaching effect on Syria's national security. As a result of the civil war, Lebanon was now informally divided into its various sectarian strongholds. The Maronites, under the leadership of Bashir Jumayl, sought to reassert Maronite supremacy in an alliance with Israel. Israel, like the Maronites, was opposed to the Palestinian military presence in Lebanon. Israel and the Palestinians frequently traded blows, and in the summer of 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon with the objective of removing the Palestinian fighting forces from their stronghold there. Israel also sought to revive Maronite supremacy in Lebanon and seemed to be achieving its objectives when Bashir Jumayl was elected president in August 1982 as Israel occupied Beirut. The bulk of the Palestinian fighting forces were compelled to withdraw from Lebanon in early September, to be dispersed in various distant Arab states, and Israel seemed to be having its way. But Syria would not let that be. Bashir was assassinated by operatives on Syria's behalf in mid-September, resulting in the notorious Maronite massacre of revenge against Palestinians in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in Beirut. Since the Israeli military was still present in the area, many accusations were leveled against Israel for not doing what it was believed that it should have or could have done to prevent the massacre. Bashir Jumayel was replaced by his brother Amin as president of Lebanon. But Amin and Bashir, though brothers, were similar in their divergent outlooks to Bishar al-Khoury and Emile Edeh of the 1930s and the 1940s. Amin Jumayel, like Bishar al-Khoury before him, believed in the securing of the Maronites in an agreement with the Arab world, which in the new circumstances meant subservience to Syria. Bashir had sought an alliance with Israel, which replaced France as had been the case in Edeh's formula of old. But the assassination of Bashir and the massacre in Sabra and Shatila had emptied the Maronite-Israeli alliance of any practical content. Israel wanted no more to do with Lebanese domestic affairs and restricted its interest in Lebanon to the defense of its northern border. Israel therefore withdrew from Lebanon in 1985, except from a narrow security zone in the south, and it finally withdrew from there too in 2000. In the meantime, as the Maronites continued their political decline, the Shiites shifted from the periphery to the center of Lebanese politics. Syria was now the hegemonic power in most of Lebanon until it finally withdrew its forces in 2005. Socio-economic developments of the 1950s and the 1960s led many Shiis to migrate from their traditional locations in the south and in the Bekaa, that is, eastern Lebanon, to the capital of Beirut. Their rate of natural increase outstripped that of other communities, and they displaced the Maronites as the most populous community in the country. By the mid-1970s, all Christians, Maronites and other Christian minorities, were hardly 40% of the total. And under the charismatic leadership in the 1960s and 1970s of the Shiite cleric Imam Musa Sadr, the community became considerably more assertive in demanding their fair share of the Lebanese pie in accordance with their increasing demographic weight. The civil war further enhanced Shiite political assertiveness as they formed their own militias, first Amal and then Hezbollah, which became the major Shiite force politically and militarily in the 1980s. In April 1985, the Shiites took over West Beirut, thus physically cementing their growing power at the very center of Lebanese politics. The civil war finally came to an end in 1989 with the signing of the Taif Accord. Taif, that is, the city in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia and other Arab states were those who gave their auspices to the new agreement on peace in Lebanon. The Taif Accords formalized the ascendance of the Shiites. In the 1943 National Pact, they were only third in line, as we remember, and received the crumbs left to them by the Maronites and the Sunnis. But now they were formally on a par with the Maronites and the Sunnis, and that was only formally, because in fact they were the most powerful community in Lebanon, both demographically and politically, backed by the punch of their armed militia Hezbollah, for which the Lebanese army is no match and for which no other community had any answer. And to that one must of course add Syria's managing influence over Lebanese politics at the time. Christian-dominated Lebanon, under the hegemony of the Maronites, as established in Greater Lebanon of 1920, does not exist any longer. If the question once was, is Lebanon an Arab state or a Christian-dominated pro-Western country? The question now is Lebanon still part of the Sunni Arab world, or is it becoming a client or an outpost of non-Arab Shiite Iran, thanks to the preeminence of Hezbollah and the Shiites in Lebanese politics?